It's an overview of the readings for the fifth topic in our course on Introduction to Language Documentation and Description on Transcription and Orthography. Readings in this topic include discussion of the linguistic aspects of orthography design, questions of the acceptability of an orthography for a community it's designed for, various perspectives on literacy in endangered languages, some technical aspects of transcribing recorded text, including one reading on automated speech recognition for endangered languages. The references for readings for this week's topic. The first reading, Cahill 2018, is the initial reading you should be reading for this week's discussion, as well as Essegbey 2015. Cahill 2018 is a recent chapter in a handbook on endangered languages covering orthography design and implementation. Cahill presents orthography as something necessary for several aspects related to language documentation. This includes the use of pedagogical grammars in the community, the creation of dictionaries, the creation of accessible and usable corpora, and literacy. Cahill summarizes aspects of literacy design and implementation into two categories. The first, the question of usability, that is, how easily an orthography can be used to read and write. And under this topic, issues of linguistics and technical or logistical issues are considered. And the other aspect of factors to consider come under the heading of acceptability, namely how much do people want to use the orthography, and here more political and social factors are considered. One of Cahill's main points is that orthography design is highly contextualized, and what works in one community might not work in another community in a different area. Here's a quote from Cahill highlighting the different aspects and roles of orthography. An orthography is both a tool and a symbol. It is a tool through which local literacy can happen. It is also an emblem of identity for a language community. The functions of an orthography are both pragmatic and symbolic. Another reading is an older overview of orthography development in another handbook by Seifart, 2006. Seifart introduces some of the more technical aspects of orthography design, looking at the difference between morphographic systems, illustrated by Chinese characters, and phonographic symbols, which can be syllabic or alphabetic. Seifart also discusses the differences between deep and shallow orthographies, introducing some of the related topics such as orthographic depth, functional load, and underrepresentation. A number of non-linguistic factors are also discussed, including the psycholinguistic aspect of orthographies for reading and writing, pedagogical tensions, the differences between the needs of beginners and advanced users, between fluent speakers of a language and learners of a language, and the relative ease of reading versus writing using a particular orthography. Also covers other related issues such as how to deal with existing orthographies, dialectical variation, and other technical issues. Seifart's article ends with 5 case studies that looks at particular decisions that need to be made in orthography design and explains why a particular decision was implemented in each context. Here's a quote from Seifart on the complexity of orthography design. The idea persists that a good orthography is simply one that represents all phonological contrast. However, orthography development is in fact a highly complex issue, which involves not only phonological, prosodic, grammatical, and semantic aspects of the language to be written, but also a wide variety of non-linguistic issues, among them pedagogical and psycholinguistic aspects of reading and writing, and the sociolinguistic situation. Bird 1999's article on tone marking in Cameroonian language goes a bit deeper into the technical aspects of orthography design. There's a small but growing number of articles on experimental studies of the usability of orthographies, particularly looking at how to mark tone in orthographies, and Bird's paper is probably the most cited among these. This paper reviews an experimental study of the usability of tone marking in the Jang or Yemba language of Cameroon. The paper reviews several previous experimental studies that were done on other languages in Africa, and then describes an experiment in which 16 Shang speakers were recorded reading 4 stories, 2 of which were written with some diacritic tone marking on the words, and 2 which were written without any diacritic tone marking. The results show that the tone marking actually ends up with resulting in slower reading and more disfluencies for the native speakers. Now, Bird is careful not to overextend the results to saying that tone marking is always negative, but looking at the particular comparison made between one kind of tone marking and texts in which there are no tone marking, the conclusion is in this quote: "I have demonstrated that this combination of tone marking and pedagogy is actually worse than zero tone marking. Reading is slower for marked text, and the presence of tone marks does not reduce the number of hesitations and repetitions. No lexical comprehension errors arise from zero marking. This experiment counts as another vote in favor of maintaining fixed word images." Lüpke's 2011 paper is another overview of orthography development for a handbook, this one a bit more focused on the social and political aspects of orthography design. Lüpke discusses the ecology of writing in multilingual settings where endangered languages are spoken, introducing some terminology to help discuss the different ways in which speakers of endangered languages may act with writing, such as digraphia, multigraphia, and exographia. Lüpke advocates for the use of audiovisual materials, which in many cases may be preferable to the use of transcribed text when trying to work with the community for language maintenance or language revival. Lüpke also spends some time arguing against the idea that certain scripts may be better suited to particular languages, stating that any script can in fact be adapted to any language, given the example of the Arabic script being applied to the Hausa language in Nigeria. One of Lüpke's conclusions and emphases is that design decisions in orthography implementation should be made collaboratively with the community members. In this quote, Lüpke emphasizes the importance of understanding the context when working with orthography design. Although writing in the mother tongue is recognized as an important linguistic right, literacy can only be successful if there are adequate and varied materials available for reading and instruction. This means that the potential role and scope of literacy as a social practice rather than a technical skill in an endangered language needs to be evaluated prior to orthography development, and that graphization has to be embedded with care into the larger task of corpus planning. Again, emphasizing the need for careful consideration of orthography design, Lüpke writes, "Graphization is impossible to achieve as an add-on to a linguistic documentation project unless sufficient time and resources are set aside for orthography development to avoid short-lived and tokenistic outcomes." Grenoble and Whaley's 2006 book, Saving Languages, has a chapter on literacy for language maintenance or language revitalization. This is beyond the primary focus of this course, which is language documentation, but it's included here to emphasize that anyone considering expanding an orthography use for language documentation to also use it in a literacy program needs to consider the larger context of how a literacy program can be successful. Grenoble and Whaley discuss some of the stated advantages and potential disadvantages of a literacy program for an endangered language. They say that literacy can bring prestige, it can bring school-based revitalization programs, and it can introduce the language into other domains of use where it wasn't previously used. But they say that others have warned that literacy can negatively impact oral culture, It can privilege one dialect over others in a community, and it can facilitate transition to a majority language, counterintuitively speeding up the process of language shift. They discuss different models of literacy: a traditional model, an autonomous model, a functional model, and the school of what's called New Literacy Studies. They emphasize that the success of a local literacy program depends on attitudes of the speakers themselves, depends on the context for literacy, depends on the method of standardization, and on the choice of literacy teachers. Despite acknowledging the potential danger of literacy programs to have negative side effects in certain contexts, they still recommend literacy in most cases where it may help maintain a language, and recommend a model of multiple literacies based on grassroots organization. This quote gives some insight into Grenoble Whaley's perspective. The single most important consideration in developing the right sort of literacy program is the attitude of the community towards its own language and toward the act of writing. Language attitudes as a whole are shaped by a complex set of sociolinguistic factors. At the same time, patterns of language use have an impact on language attitudes. What emerges then is a set of reciprocal relationships between language use, attitudes, and sociolinguistic factors, indeed many of the very same factors which can influence language shift and loss. The next paper is by Essegbey in 2015. In this paper, Essegbey accounts his own experience working with the Nyagbo language in Ghana, developing an orthography that ended up unintentionally creating some controversy and confusion in the community. While having experienced some of the potential negative side effects of orthography design and acknowledging the complications of a literacy program, Essegbey now proposes that orthography should be conceived of as minimally associating symbols with sounds, but allowing diverse approaches to literacy and writing in a community. And this means that someone working in a language documentation program can promote an orthography or a transcription method without having to establish an entire literacy program. This quote summarizes some of Essegbey's proposals. Rather than focus on the development of a standard orthography system, documenters should rather develop systems that enable communities to write in the vernacular. Such systems use, quote, orthographic transcription, which minimally ensures the association of sounds with letters. Beyond that, speakers are allowed to write as they speak. This means that colloquial expressions and dialectal differences would be incorporated into the system of writing. This paper by Marten Petzell in 2016 looks at a language called Kagulu in Tanzania. The authors compare the recording that was done in a language documentation project for this language with the original transcription and two edited versions of the text that were done by different writers. They point out that there are many factors that influence how multilingual speakers decide to employ the different linguistic codes that they have in their speech and in their writing. And they point out that an approach by language documentation workers that preserves multiple versions of a text, such as different edited versions of the text done by different people for different purposes, allows documentation of this kind of variation in a language context setting. Here's a quote from Marten Petzell. A problem for language documentation in this context is the representation of the different varieties along the poles of, quote, pure and, quote, modern varieties. On the one hand, documentation aims at presenting the language's lexical and structural resources as extensively as possible, including forms and features of pure varieties or ancestral code. On the other hand, documentation has to be faithful to actual language use and linguistic practices embedded in contemporary communicative ecologies, and to the heterogeneity and dynamics inherent in any language, thus taking account of modern varieties as well. Marten Petzell's evaluation of the various versions of the text that they collected is as follows. All versions of the story are representations of authentic Kagulu, and that it is precisely the dynamics of the development of the different versions and the interaction of language context, standardization, spoken versus written text creations, and speaker agencies, particularly in this case within a language documentation project, which provide the context in which to interpret and understand the particular language ecology and language dynamics of Kagulu. This next paper by Moeller in 2014 is a review of a software program. The paper introduces Seifart, which is a free and user-friendly program that helps create time-aligned transcription files specifically for language documentation. The files that are created are in the same format as the Elon program for time-aligned transcription files, and so they're interchangeable with that program. Seifart additionally supports an organized approach to metadata collection. It's quite an easy-to-use program, but it does have some disadvantages or limitations. For one, it cannot handle multiple speakers. It doesn't allow multiple translations into multiple languages, for example, and it also does not allow interlinear glossing. However, because of the file formats that are used in Seifart, annotations that are created in Seifart can easily be transferred to other programs for further annotation. Another paper on some of the technological aspects of language documentation is by Michaud et al., published in 2018 in Language Documentation and Conservation as well. This paper discusses one attempt to apply automated speech recognition to the transcription of recordings in the context of a documentation project. Typically, for majority languages, ASR relies on enormous amounts of data which are not available to people working with language documentation of minority languages or endangered languages. The paper reviews the application of an open source toolkit called Persophony, which was designed for low resource contexts. And they demonstrate how this program was successfully applied to transcribe recordings of a language called Yongning Na, a tonal language of southwest China. They say the error rate was only 17%, which is taken as a very high rate of accuracy in this context. However, in order to get that successful result, they were required to work with data that included meticulous transcriptions, and the data was also all done by a single speaker. The authors describe their own process of collaboration between computer scientists and linguists and encourage others to consider this kind of collaboration in the future in this quote. Interdisciplinary dialogue is interesting for all concerned. The tool's designers and developers are researchers with a strong background in computer science and an interest in linguistics. They get feedback from the linguist, ranging from analyses of the errors made by a transcription tool to copious wish lists for new developments. The linguists gain an additional perspective into their research topics. For instance, new linguistics insights can be gained in the process of error analysis because automated phonemic transcription yields a signal-shaped view of the recordings, which can be compared with the linguist's brain-shaped transcription. There are many further resources available for continuing to investigate the implications of orthography, design, and literacy for work in language documentation and work with endangered languages. Some of these are cited in some of the articles that we've looked at today, or the collections that some of the chapters we've read are included in.